The Crooked Epic. 1. Inn. 1. The Inn of Maniacal Madness. 4. Ted. The Cave. 4B. 1. Noontime slid by without any abnormal occurrence aside from the dragging hours of the morning after breakfast when Ted sat alone in his bedroom, knowing he was forbidden from going outside even with an adult at home. Of course, it was not an average day for him by a long shot, with his father and brother both not there. All that day he strained to complete any possible research on Hobb, or even the remedial activities to regain his bravery, and his reserved strength quickly faltered into menial and repetitive cycles of the unfocused zone and traumatic tics. With Alex missing, Ted's lack of self-discipline only enhanced his realization of how he had lost concentration somehow due to the frightening shocks which were now plaguing his subconscious. Ted had suffered some amnesia, but quickly regained his memories in an overwhelming feeling of ominous anxiety. Mrs. Wilson used some mornings to do a major reorganizing of the cellar. It was up to Ted to keep himself busy and not let inevitably hopeless circumstances get the best of his emotions. Mrs. Wilson was down in the basement and Ted felt alone. Depression started setting in at 12:30 and Ted became anxious about Mr. Hurst's 2 o'clock appointment. The weather was bleaker than the days before. A dark cloud hovered on the eastern horizon. The barn was shadowy inside the open loft window, and the tool shed puddle had hardly shrunk since he had seen it on Friday night and followed the footsteps. Noticing that the trail was gone, he began to worry more, became mournful of his lost family members, and began sensing fear and intervening rage. He was formulating guilt for not returning to Hobb to rescue Alex, even without their father's assistance or anyone else's help. Finally, at 1:30 in the afternoon, Ted heard the front door open and close. Father called down the basement steps to Mrs. Wilson to help carry the groceries inside, and he turned off the radio station which he was listening to aside in the den room. Christopher Good had been subdued by the loss of his eldest son and felt as though extra help was necessary. As father walked back to the front door, Ted hurried over to say hello. They met by the stairway, and Christopher asked for his help because Ted's appointment was less than half an hour away, and he rushed home to ensure the groceries were put away. Agreeing to help, they each began to unload the car. The back seat was packed with bags, and it looked as if it potentially would take extra trips to and from the kitchen. Thinking of how he could shorten their steps, Ted started by eagerly carrying too many bags at once. Unfortunately, as one of the handles broke, a bag spilled in the yard with packages of vegetables falling onto the ground near the tool shed. Leaving the spilled bag on the ground, Ted dropped off the rest of the packages in his arms in the kitchen and told Mrs. Wilson and his father that he was going back to recover the lost items in the last 3 bags. Ted noticed something awry in the yard near the barn from the front door. There was a low-moving blur of grass blades toward the driveway around some grocery items. Slowly, he stayed on his toes and approached carefully. There had been strange things going on the property that weekend, when using precautions may have provided preventative measures. As he walked near the picnic table, he started to stretch his shoulders up and try to gain height for perspective. When he did this, small tufts of fur became visible, darting around through the grass and fallen groceries. Closing in on 5 feet from the commotion, several of a small horde of rats dashed away from the mud and dirt around the barn. The disgusting creatures climbed over one another with matted hair and scurried into other areas of the barn and yard. Begrudgingly, Ted picked up what he could hold of the fallen groceries, except a packed sack of rice, and returned to the house. Just inside the front door, Ted set down the items and inspected carrots, cabbages, corn cobs, and a sack of potatoes protected from vermin. Once satisfied, he ran back to grab 2 more bags. Fitting one in each arm, he glanced down at the rice and rushed back to the house with the packages. On the final trip to the car, he climbed in and grabbed the last bag out of the car's front seat and shut the door, leaned over to gently pick up the rice in its newly and strangely frayed sack. The barn door rumbled. A shuddering tremble shook the walls so violently that chips of red paint from the trim fell around the tool shed, and he put the packs back down on the grass to investigate. At first, he waited for it to rumble again, standing still and staring at the barn with intensity. It was as if the walls could have been hit with an unrecognizable strong wind, although there had been no gust he would have felt in the yard, nor were there leaves in the trees where he should have seen them shaking across the lot in the back. But the violent quaking had stopped, and he was only wasting time if not bringing back groceries away from the rodents, which were sure to return to their gross breathing. It instinctively occurred to him that the rats were the sign of the bigger problem, as if the food being left out was attracting them, but whatever had indeed brought them to their house was a problem he was more interested in solving. Forgetting the barn, he packed up the bags and went into the house with them. After Father had thanked him for the help, Ted quickly looked at the clock to see how long he should have until Mr. Hurst arrived. There were 15 minutes until 2 p.m., and he looked around for Mrs. Wilson. Father was putting food into the cabinets and cupboards of the kitchen and restocking the pantry. The cellar door was open, so he walked over and looked down the stairs into the darkness below. Something about the dark where he heard Mrs. Wilson finishing her cleaning project, rummaging through their mongered belongings, and organizing, reminded Ted of the cave on the hill. He remembered the loss of his older brother in the strange land of Hob again. Mrs. Wilson moved into the faint light which reached through the door to the bottom of the stairs, carrying a garbage bin filled with broom sweepings, filthy rags, and odd stocked items with expirations defying the memory of anyone. "Mrs. Wilson, were there rats in the basement?" In response, Mrs. Wilson's face conveyed a displeased embarrassment for Ted's interpreted accidental accusation of her sanitization methods' effectiveness, or of their family houses lacking necessary upkeep, or generally at any ecosystem in which was the culpability of such disgusting infestations. Meanwhile, Father had finished restocking the kitchen and pantry with perishables and goods and walked up from behind Ted across the school study room. Father silently paused between Alex's and Ted's seats. He looked at Ted and then out to the window with a dismayed frown. Mrs. Wilson saw momentary distraction, using the few seconds to reconsider her reply. She began coming up the steps as she spoke. "No, dear, there was nothing down there. No creepy crawly critters in this cellar, nor even a spider. Sure, there were cobwebs, but no spiders running around or scampering out. There wasn't even much down here except extra cleaning supplies, some cooking utensils, boxes of dining sets, and the icebox." By the time she reached the top step, she saw how Ted was now looking at Father and continued. "There were a few boxes I didn't open or touch. I assumed they were heirlooms, mostly in a trunk down there. But no, sweetie, no mice, no rats, mostly just dust." It made Ted feel better by looking down in the basement independently. So Ted let Mrs. Wilson walk the bin outside by herself without trying to tell everybody what he had seen, lest he make more of a fool of himself in front of them. Without turning to look back, Ted hit a switch on the side of the stairway and started to walk down the steps into the basement. The downstairs lights were still off, so he hit another switch stationed on a support post halfway across the room. There was nothing there as he looked around, but he walked back to the storm door and pushed it open to check everywhere. Another grave rumbling filled the air, and the ground shook as it grew louder and echoed in the small area between the back doorway and the steps to the backyard. When it stopped, he identified how it had been different from the sound by the barn and the way it more resembled an engine running and idling before being turned off. "Teddy, Mr. Hurst is here," Ted's father yelled from the top of the stairs. Recalling that he should turn the lights back off, he returned to the post and hit the switch, which seemed to instantly coincide with another, deeper rumbling which shook the basement and stopped when he flicked the light off simultaneously. Running back upstairs, Ted felt around in his pocket for the amulet, thinking about how he could show it to Mr. Hurst. Somehow, he had forgotten that he had not found it in the pants or clothes he wore the day before, making it another piece of the mysterious Hob now, seemingly lost in his subconscious, returned from the cave. Subsequently, while walking through the observation study toward the window, Ted wondered if a severe concussion caused memory loss. He thought if the missing amulet had something to do with the effectively transplanting him into an unknown part of the cave, and then still, what the actual origin of the amulet had been. Finally, Ted saw Mr. Hurst's car parked beside theirs at the window and noticed that the barn door was now opened. However, Mr. Hurst himself was nowhere to be seen. Ted's father was upstairs and he could not hear Mrs. Wilson. The house was hushed and Ted felt surreal, lonesome anxiety. Prodigiously, Ted was curious to see Mr. Hurst outside the school walls with its parameters. In the basement, after discovering the absence of his amulet, other tentative agendas came to fruition for their interview that afternoon. This included the local geography, which eluded research, attempts at deciphering those languages Ted had seen on the walls of the guardhouse in Hobb, and details on Darren's disappearance or death, to help them verify the suspicious activity they had witnessed at the lake. 2 excruciatingly slow minutes elapsed, during which Ted's impatience grew and Mr. Hurst still was not in plain view from the front windows where he was waiting. So he decided to head back through the dining room and pantry to see if he had already entered the house, although there were no voices from the other areas. Then Mrs. Wilson appeared in the den room, reading the Bible on the sofa, and she smiled when he walked by. A tea kettle was quickly coming to a steaming boil unattended on the stovetop. The side door was closed, and there was no sign of Mr. Hurst, so he asked Mrs. Wilson if she had seen him yet, and she tried to reassure Ted how she had seen him pulling his car into the driveway, and that he should be inside any second. Unfortunately, Ted's warnings of ill-boding danger had gone unheeded, regarded as nugatory. After opening the side door, Ted started to smell something repugnant out in the yard. The stench grew more odoriferous as he walked over to the barn, and he heard a repetitive clicking and tapping, which stopped and started behind the barn door. Then a loud squeak, followed by a shuffling sound like multiple pairs of legs were moving around inside the barn, and more squeaking. Within 15 feet of the barn door, he heard crunching noises, ripping, wet smacking, and grumbling. The right-hand door was open, and it swung back in the barn to lean on a work table, which seemed unnatural because although one end would pivot slightly, the double doors were intended to slide out of the way to the left and right on rails behind the front walls. Besides this inconsistency, he did not see anything too alarming or out of the ordinary, so he entered the barn, thinking maybe Mr. Hurst had found something they had left behind from the groceries. Perhaps the rats that he had seen were coming back to scavenge again.